This is video 2 for Unit 5 for October 28th. We just talked about the industrial technology expansion with new types of products besides textiles, and also the importance of the telegraph. So now we're going to look at railroads, and this is when railroads become king. Railroads overtake canals and other roads completely by the 1840s and 50s, and then railroads becomes one of America's first major businesses. So by the 1840s, canal building had basically stopped. So canal building was too expensive and irrational to build when you have railways now. So by the 1840s, canal building is now done, and you have the rapid expansion of railways across the country. Remember, this time all you have is carriages, so no cars. So railways become the main method of transportation for everybody, and every type of good sold and so forth in this time period. So lots of expansion of rail lines, especially in the northern parts of the United States. So everything from Boston, New York, over to Detroit, Chicago, and those areas, all that area is going to be littered with railways. And once they have railways, it's going to create factories and bigger cities and so forth. By the 1850s, railroads were the largest industry in America. By the 1850s, railroad companies were the largest industries in the United States. And they will become America's first big business, or for America's first major business. Large amounts of capital and labor for railways led into complex businesses. So you're going to see some of the first major corporations be railroad companies, lots of major stock holding companies. These are all private, so the railways are built by private companies, not by the government. And so, but because everyone used them, they were highly successful. So railways become massive in this time period. Local farmers and merchants bought stock in companies to help get more money for themselves. Local and state government helped these companies by granting special loans and tax breaks. You're going to see early on, especially, the government and railways were very much in league with one another because the more railways expand, the more people expand, and the more business and Americans and states can expand, essentially. So governments did not stand in the way of railway expansion in this time period. So local and state government helped by granting special loans and tax breaks to railroad companies. By 1850, the U.S. government granted 2.6 million acres of federal land to just the Illinois Central Railroad Company. So by 1850, the U.S. government granted 2.6 million acres of federal land to Illinois Central Railway Company because they wanted these guys to make these railroad lines out west. It gets people out there faster, and so the government is giving away this land to help to sell the West more and help to create more civilization, which is exactly what both people want. So the railroad companies directly benefit off of U.S. government policies. Cheap transportation promoted Western agriculture and connected to the West. So because railroads are usually pretty cheap to travel on, it promoted people going out west, developing farms, and then shipping it back east. That way you could grow corn and wheat out in places like Nebraska or wherever and ship it back east and make money that way. The railways that are being put down in the Midwest and New England areas and the North in general will be very instrumental in helping the North win the Civil War. And the South, like we said, mostly agricultural, still use waterways, built very few rail lines, and so they didn't see a need to. And so the railways are going to hurt the South in the Civil War, and it's going to help the North in the Civil War. Then we look at foreign commerce. Growth of U.S. manufactured goods and agricultural products increased exports and imports. So the growth of U.S. manufactured goods from the factories back east and agricultural products, both north, south, and west, increased our exports in the 1840s and 50s, which in turn helps the entire economy. It also increases our imports. As we become more interdependent, we need more products, we begin to buy more products that come from other countries too. Other factors influence our expansion of trade in the 1840s and 50s. Number one, shipping firms encourage scheduled travel across the Atlantic. So once we have better ships that we can predict when they actually will arrive, first with better sail ships and later with steamships, you have these shipping firms that schedule ships back and forth across the ocean, so now they're more predictable, which means they're more reliable as far as taking a ship back and forth across the ocean, which means that more people will travel, more companies will ship their goods across the seas. That's one reason why expansion of trade increases. Number two, the demand for whale oil caused a whaling boom in the 1830s to 1860s. A lot of people are using whale oil to use in their homes for lamps and so forth. That becomes high in demand as a result. So you got a lot of fishermen going out there hunting whales, nearly to extinction, but it becomes a big profitable business, which, again, more ships out at sea helps with trade. The third reason, ship improvements got better and better. So you also get better ship improvements. So you had the old sail ships. Then you get a new class of ship called a clipper ship, and I know you can't see it well. This is a picture of a clipper ship, which the way its sails are designed, the way the hull is designed, makes it go faster. A clipper ship could cut the time of travel from New York to San Francisco from 5 to 6 months to 89 days. So a clipper ship cut the travel time from 5 to 6 months from New York all the way down and around South America to California, San Francisco, from 5 to 6 months to 89 days. After clipper ships, you get steamships. So first you have clipper ships with better sails and better hulls. Then you get steamships that have the, of course, now engine-powered travel, which makes travel even faster. So steamships replaced clippers in the 1850s with greater storage capacity. So not only were these ships faster, they also had a lot more storage room, which means you have a lot more ability to ship a lot more products. And these are even more reliable. Now you can take a ship from Europe to America and get here in a matter of a week or two, depending on where you're coming from. So things like the steamships and clipper ships were extremely beneficial to travel. And steamships are extremely cheap to ship goods on. So when you have steamships, whether it's a riverboat or one that goes across the ocean, it lowers the cost of travel, it lowers the cost of trade, and now you have a regular shipping schedule. You pretty much can predict exactly when a ship will or will not arrive. The fifth and final reason why we have this expansion of trade is that we're also, okay, we've been trading with Europe forever. We've always had this European trade, but we want to expand our markets. More industry means we're making more products, and the more people we sell it to, the better we'll be. So why not try to get into Asian markets? We've had basically no attempt at trying to get into Asian markets until the 1850s. So in the 1850s, this is under Millard Fillmore in the early 50s. Millard Fillmore sends out Commodore Matthew Perry with a fleet of ships to go to Japan. So Commodore Matthew Perry will be this American Navy commander who will go with a fleet of ships to Japan to open up trade. At this time period, China and Japan were very isolated. They hadn't industrialized yet because of their isolation, and they were very closed off to foreigners and foreign ideals. But we saw kind of how China got opened up a little bit before this by the British and other countries, and so we thought, why don't we go try Japan? So Commodore Matthew Perry is sent to go to Japan in 1850, and he arrives in 1854. And while there, he basically shows up with these warships. And there's a picture of it right here too. He shows up with these warships and basically demands that Japan opens their port. And since we show up and we're stronger and we're becoming more industrialized than they are, they don't really have much of a choice. So Commodore Matthew Perry's trip essentially forces open trade with Japan to us and to other countries. But this is our first major stepping stone towards opening up Asian markets, which it means more places to sell to, which means more profits for Americans. And so Japan opens up 2 ports to U.S. ships, and now we're trading with Europe and Asia. And then finally we have another panic. Like I said, like clockwork, about every 20 years you have a panic that takes place in the United States. This one is not one of the major ones to be aware of. So all the boom of expansion of businesses and railways and so forth kind of dropped off by the mid-1850s. There's a serious drop in prices for farmers and increased unemployment in this panic in the North. So the Panic of 1857 affects mostly the North and their factories. So their prices drop, and there's increased unemployment for these people living up north. South and cotton were not really affected. And so the panic, when it only affects the North, creates this belief or this myth that the South is doing a good job of sticking with cotton because they're not affected by these economic downturns. So Southerners become even more defensive or reliant upon slavery and farming and cotton and so forth, because they feel like, hey, we weren't touched by this economic crisis, and y'all were the areas that are industrializing. So it helps to continue the South's superiority complex when it comes to comparison to the North. All right, so that's pretty much wraps up the Chapter 17 material. We're now going to look at Chapter 18 and looking at how the country begins to divide itself apart. So before we go into the territory debacle and so forth, let's just kind of talk about the general sectional conflict development. Historians debate why the Civil War occurred, but here are the 4 reasons essentially why they occur. And you can assign yourself how much one is over the other, but these are essentially the 4 reasons why the Civil War is going to occur. Number 1 is slavery. I mean, that's probably the most obvious, is that as time has gone on from the 1830s until the 1850s and 60s, slavery has become more of a moral issue for the North, and people have only gotten louder and more and only stronger chastising slavery. So the North was kind of didn't say too much about it before, but by the 1840s and 50s, you're going to see organizations against slavery, you're going to see movements against slavery, you're going to see like the Liberty Party against slavery, William Lloyd Garrison. So now, not every single person up north was an abolitionist. That's one thing that should be noted too, that not every single Northerner was actually an abolitionist, but most Northerners did not want to see slavery expand. That is something that most Northerners wanted. So most Northerners were not trying to free slaves or stop slavery completely, but most did not want to see the expansion of slavery, and that becomes more of an issue as time has gone on. And the South, of course, just keeps defending it and wants to see it expand. That's one reason why the Civil War occurs. Second reason why the Civil War occurs is a difference over constitutional role. The South is still very much a states' rights-oriented region. They want more power for the states, and they don't want too much federal control over them. And so you still see this fight over states' rights and their abilities versus the federal government's abilities over them too. We've already seen this once with the nullification crisis in 1830s. But that continues to be an issue here as far as what the roles of national versus state government would be. The third reason are economic differences. The North is based mostly on industrial factories. There's some farming up north, but most of their economy is run and operated by industry, whereas the South is essentially all agricultural. And so things like tariffs, internal improvements, and banking were divisive issues amongst these two groups, as we saw with the Whigs and Democrats, that the South does not like tariffs, the North loves tariffs because it helps protect industry. The South doesn't want to pay for internal improvements, whereas the North feels like it's a good thing to have for the entire country. The South didn't like a national bank, the North did like a central banking system because it helped their businesses. So the different ways of life for both sides is a huge factor as far as how the North and South are growing apart. And then the fourth and final reason, both sides had political blunders and extremism. So both North and South, Whigs and Democrats, they all had political blunders, not great leadership, and extremism. And we're going to see examples of all this over the next couple days. But all these different things added up to there being a big fight or debacle over, basically no compromise. Like both sides become so extreme, neither side wants to compromise when it comes to these issues. So both sides become so entrenched and so set in their ways that nobody wants to compromise with their issues because there's so much political extremism happening, kind of like right now. So, all right, we're going to briefly get into the conflicts over the status of territories, and then we'll stop. So we're basically going forward now with the next election, 1848. And the big issue now is that we have all this territory from the Mexican-American War that we just got. Like this has just been within the last year. We've gotten all this territory, California, the Mexican Cession, and so forth. The issue of slavery, especially into after the Mexican War, was the focus of sectional differences of the late 1840s. By 1848, there was 15 free states and 15 slave states, so there was a balance still happening here. So by 1848, there's a balance of 15 free states and 15 slave states before any new states get made out west. And so at this point, there's pretty much 3 opinions on what should happen to the territory out west that we've just acquired from Mexico. And we're going to go through those 3 opinions. So first is the free soil movement. Northern Democrats and Whigs supported the Wilmot Proviso, as we talked about, but that didn't get passed. So Northern Democrats and Whigs had supported the Wilmot Proviso, trying to stop the expansion of slavery out west. Anti-slavery forces and racists in the North found common ground on the free soil position. And when I say racist, people who didn't want to compete against blacks for jobs. That's who I mean. So, and that's from the North. So anti-slavery forces and racists in the North found common ground with the free soil position. Free soil is exactly what it sounds like, meaning that the land out west would remain free soil and there would be zero slavery on it, which would basically is the same idea as the Wilmot Proviso. Their slogan was free soil, free labor, free men, meaning that all the states, all the land, all the workers out west would all be free, never would be slave. They didn't demand the end of slavery. So that's one thing to know about the free soilers. The free soilers were not calling for the abolition of slavery. They just didn't want to see it expand because they wanted to leave that territory open to free states and to having regular laborers who get paid. And they actually just wanted the West open up to whites only as well too. So again, that kind of goes with the racist ideas that they didn't want to have to compete with blacks for jobs out west. So in 1848, they're actually going to run a candidate for office, and there actually will be a free soil party too. So there's going to be a third party called the Free Soil Party who's going to run a candidate, and their slogan is free soil, free labor, free men. The new party also advocated free homesteads and internal improvements. It's also worth noting that that the Free Soil Party talked about the idea of free homesteads out west, meaning that you get land for free, and internal improvements, both of which are going to become ideas involved in the Republican Party, which we're going to see form pretty shortly after this. The next position is the Southern position. Most Southerners viewed any attempt to resist slavery expansion as a violation of their constitutional rights over property. At this point, by the late 40s, some Southerners are just ready to go. They're just ready, like they're threatening secession already. So as early as 1848, Southerners are already threatening secession, saying like, if you try to stop us from expanding slavery out west, we're going to secede. And that's already an option on the table for some of these Southern states. The Southerners saw the abolitionists and free soilers intent on destroying slavery. And there's a difference. Abolitionists wanted slavery to stop completely. Free soilers wanted slavery not to expand. But they thought they were intent on destroying slavery and the Southern way of life. Some moderate Southerners struggled to try to keep a balance. Like, not every single Southerner believed this. Some try to argue we should expand the Missouri Compromise line, but that didn't happen either. So there were some people who thought we should expand the Missouri Compromise line all the way from here, all the way out to California, but that doesn't happen at this time period yet. And then finally, you have the popular sovereignty idea. This is a brand new idea. Lewis Cass, who's up here, Lewis Cass, a Michigan Democrat, suggested this new idea to replace the free soil movement and everybody else's position. It was kind of a compromise position. So popular sovereignty, and you need to be aware of this phrase, is a compromise solution to both sides. Hopefully, and he was trying to, when he made this idea, he was trying to get moderate support from both sides of the extremes. The idea was that Congress would allow people to go into a territory and vote to be free or slave. So it allows the settlers to go into a territory, and then when they try to get statehood, they had to vote on whether or not to be slave or free. So it puts the responsibility on the actual settlers and not on the U.S. government. So instead of Congress deciding, this would allow people in the territory to vote on slavery or not once they were ready to become a state. And that's what he proposed for all this territory out west. Okay, so we'll come back to that later on. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them, but we're going to stop there, and we'll talk about the election of 1848 when we return. So other than that, have a good weekend. See you on Tuesday.